Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm very excited about the topic today, suggested to us by Nick. First of all, hello to everyone out there watching us on Voge Academy Talks. I'm excited to say that we are either close to or past 7,000 subscribers, which is pretty exciting. So thank you all for subscribing. Tell all your family, friends, colleagues, classmates, whoever about us. I think we're doing something really special here. And I think today's topic is especially apropos for many of us, burnout. And Nick, you had suggested this topic and you provided a lot of the materials that we read to prepare. Would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Let me say, I guess I kind of realized one of the things we're doing here is going through some of these significant issues of procrastination or imposter syndrome, these things that are often discussed, even productivity, in various circles. I think they're prominent now, but I think what we bring is a different lens, and in particularly, of course, through the lens of self-worth, which gets to beliefs and values, right? The foundation of self-worth theory is that in achievement context, certain beliefs and values or sets of them can predictably lead to different kinds of interpretations, experiences, sense of self-reflection, self-talk. And I think that applies then to burnout as well, both as the cause and potentially the solution. So I think, burnout came to my attention in my work because I would just hear it from students talking about it, right? I'm burnt out. There are certain times of the year. And then the chat, what is it? Where does it come from? How does it arise? What do you do? So I think one of the dilemmas with burnout is if you're feeling burnt out, it's hard to generate the energy to make change, right? So when you're out, it's hard to make the changes needed to break out of burnout. So it may be not necessarily uniquely, but distinctively. So burnout suggests you have less energy. That's one key marker dimension. But then if you want to make changes in your environment or in your pathway or how you approach things and your routines, even the way of thinking, your relationships, that all requires energy. So I think that's fundamentally the conundrum.
When students talk to you about burnout, are they reflective enough to pinpoint some of the key, like what is draining them?
I think some, and so we're going to, some of the dimensions, and not surprisingly, not others, and those other dimensions I think I'd want to highlight in part because they're not being considered, and so they reflect our unique perspective. So I think the most common is the accumulation of a lot of work. So we usually talk about in terms of workload, and then correspondingly not having time to rest and rejuvenate. But it's usually talk about the workload. Sometimes there's a more awareness of the kind of work, right? That, okay, or at least with a little prompting, this work isn't gratifying. It's not energizing me. They'll say something like things like they're overcommitted, which I often reframe as overextended and undercommitted, in the sense that, so one of the things that happens when you're overcommitted is you don't put as much as you would need to do the thing well to get out of it what's fulfilling. So it's a cycle. You're just doing the minimum. You feel bad about that, actually, or you don't get the positive reward of growth, improvement, impact. And so commitment suggests to me something else. Actually, they're not committed. They're doing that often because it looks good, which I understand, but it creates a dynamic. So sometimes you hear that, but I don't see another kind of burnout and a kind of learned helplessness is something like the lack of fairness. Like, I put in a lot of work. I tried really hard. So these are one of the dimensions. We'll come later to actually list these out. The lack of fairness. It doesn't seem right that I have to work this hard and still not get the results that I want. So I think those are the most common. There's maybe a dimension of kind of a FOMO or a slightly different, fear of missing out, which we used to hear 5, 7, 8 years ago. Now I hear a little bit different angle on that. In students' language, they don't say I'm FOMO. They don't use that phrase so much anymore. They say to make the most of Princeton, and they feel guilty if they don't, and they have to do everything, which I think is a little different. It's not so much fearing what they're not doing, is compelled to do so many things, and that justifies their being there, and that's what they should do. Princeton has all these things, or other institutions, and I should do them all. Should, right? I should take advantage of those. And you can see that as a basic idea could easily lead to being overextended, because there's an infinite number of things that can be done virtually at Princeton or other highly resourced institutions.
Yeah, I'd love to explore that, but I think it might be better for us to go, do you think, and list out the 6
Sure.
Areas where we might, that can contribute to burnout. And this comes from 2 researchers. I don't know how to say is it Maslach?
Christina Maslach. There's a funny little story about that, and Leiter.
And Leiter, okay, from their work. So I don't know, do you want to run with that?
So as a matter of fact, Christina Maslach's office was right next door to my mentors. I knew her a little bit. I mean, I said hi, but I didn't know her. I didn't really know her work. In fact, I didn't know that she studied burnout until years later. I went and looked. So Maslach and Leiter wrote one of the first empirical studies of burnout. Right. So one of the first points I try to make to people is this is not just a colloquial term. Anything that's risen to the level of societal recognition has been studied systematically by somebody. Whether that's correct or the findings is another matter, but it has been studied. So burnout actually is used as a technical term. There's instruments that measure it, short ones, long ones. It's been studied, and there's different theoretical vantage points. So Christina Maslach is a highly trained psychologist. Actually, she was famously the student in Phil Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment.
Oh my God.
She shut it down.
Oh, good for her.
If you know that. I don't know if we'll get into that. But in any event, and so she was, I think she would identify as what's called the community psychologist. So looking at group and community. And so Maslach and Leiter went into business, corporate settings. I think Leiter might be a corporate consultant, or I don't think he's an academic, but in any event, and they're trying to understand this phenomenon, burnout, kind of a burnout syndrome meaning multiple manifestations, multiple causes, not a direct linear factor to outcome. And so they identified some symptoms that kind of indicative of it. One, which is, kind of exhaustion. Another is cynicism. So these are these markers. So people are feeling this kind of purposelessness. But the factors that contributed to it in the environment, and I think the interaction of the individual to the environment, right? So the work overload. So you can think of that as, the work is too much, but it's really overload for you. So it's you in relation to those demands, but also in a lot of contexts, people choosing the work that they do. They have some control over that. So we could ask, why are people putting themselves in positions where they're doing excessive, unrealistic expectations on the amount of work or the standards, right? How does that happen? Another feature is feeling a lack of control, so not sufficient autonomy. And we know from other research that autonomy is a really fundamental need and drive, is essential to well-being. So if you don't feel like you have control, you're being manipulated, or the constraints of in this case, your work role, are out of your decision-making control, there's not much you can do about it. That you can see how that will lead to kind of helplessness and maybe even a cynicism. A lack of reward. People don't feel that they've gotten the rewards that they deserve, or they feel like they haven't got sufficient recognition. And again, we can see how that would undermine motivation, and motivation is energy for action. So not having energy sounds like burnout. Also a lack of community. So feeling isolated, not having positive connections, maybe conflict or friction with people in your immediate work environment or school environment. So, and just to pause here, I do hear students say that they, like, I haven't found my people, or I've had students more explicitly say, some really thoughtful ones, my values don't align with the institutional values, and we're coming to that. But that means then also the people in it. So I'm not career oriented, but all my peers seem to be. I don't really want to be a consultant, or I do, but that's not valued, or whatever. So the community is the people, but often the basis of those relationships and interaction is something like values, right? So the fundamental one for me is this idea of a value conflict, that there's clashing requirements and expectations between institutional or group values and principles and one's own. And then if you feel like you're unable to act in accordance with your values, you feel thwarted, right? And so again, just to exemplify this a little bit, I've heard Princeton students say in other places, they're so busy they can't act on their religious practices that they really are important. And that's really just that disjuncture, you can see, creates a lot of turmoil, right? These are their deepest values, principles, moral framework, and if they feel like they can't act on that because of institutional or other structures or limitations. And then another one is this kind of this idea of a lack of fairness. It's not fair. I think I used that before, but if there's some kind of one thing I think around this in my work is, like, students are frustrated when the expectations are not made explicit. That seems unfair. There's other ways you might describe that, but I think students experience that as unfairness. So if I don't know that you're going to give me a problem on the exam that looks a lot different than the homework, then I feel like when I see it, I think you're trying to trick me. And that feels unfair, rather than if I tell you, I'm going to throw some problems at you that look different, because that's exactly what we're trying to teach you, which is to transfer your knowledge and problem solve, be able to solve problems you've not seen before. That's the point of the class. So we're going to see if you can do that. That's making that explicit. Not only, there's ways, again, you can think of a variety of points of view, but at the very least, we can say there's a kind of explicitness and fairness of treatment. Like, what I say I'm going to do is a kind of fairness. There's another kind of fairness, which is we might call horizontal. We actually talk about this in the book, Life Beyond Grades. Am I being treated in the same way as others? Do I have is the playing field equal for all of us? Can we all have access to achievement? And an achievement motivational framework, that's really important.
Do you see that? Because I could see that. When I was at Princeton University, I took the intro level computer science course, for the Java, and I had years of coding experience. I hadn't coded in Java, but it was super easy for me to pick it up. Just kind of, like if you with language acquisition, you learn one language, it's much easier to learn a second language or a third language. Same thing with computer science. Once you learn one language, you kind of know the syntax and how to kind of very quickly pick it up. So I was surprised how inequitable it was, because you had these students who had, like me, been coding for a while and probably knew Java. And so the class was a breeze for them. And then you had certain students, this was their first time coding. And it was very obvious, very apparent in the precepts and whatnot that it wasn't an equal playing ground. So do students talk about that much, that they, it just seems like everyone else, or there's a certain group of students who are, they come into this class and they probably should be in a higher class, but they wanted to come back to this class to maybe, who knows?
So you talk about that, and for whatever reason, coding might be the most obvious. I think in part because people can learn coding outside of school,
right?
More than you could learn calculus outside of school, but or multivariable. I don't think that's very common. But yeah, students do comment on that. I think actually in some ways they don't comment on it enough, because they make a different attribution. They don't think, I wonder if this person who's in precept speaking Latin as if it's their second language has some preparation that I do not.
Right.
No, they think, oh, they're a genius, right? And so that attribution, so that's a more common, I think. But students do notice it, and I think it's a really hard thing for a university to manage.
Right.
Is not managed very much, meaning you're drawing we're a highly international institution. So what are all those education systems like? With the United States, there's tons of different kinds of schooling, with admission requirements and test reporting. You just don't know how people have arrived to sit in that seat. Right. And then one of the things I would just add too, I think one of the things that's really crucial for burnout and imposter syndrome and procrastination is this mental process of attribution. How do you explain the cause of what you're observing and experiencing? Mm-hmm. That's a mental process. So how do you explain your own burnout? to yourself. Relatedly, how do you explain someone else's performance or your performance relative to them? This is a crucial mental process that's underlying a lot of people's experiences, right? They're they're encountering something, they're interpreting, they're making an explanation. That explanation often has to do with something about themselves.
Right. Well, I think that, it's a good first step. I really appreciate that. It's easy just to think there might be one or two factors when, here we have 6. So that is a first step towards helping ourselves and others to think more holistically and comprehensively about why we might be experiencing burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's like our procrastination course. It's easy to think, oh, it's just like, it's behavioral or contextual or it's cognitive, like the way I'm talking to myself, versus realizing there's 3 other dimensions that could be affecting you. So I thought this was great initially, just to help us say, it may not just be lack of community. It may not just be lack of control. There might be other factors at play here that you need to consider.
Yeah, let me make a couple comments about that. One, I think the subsequent research has tried, and maybe has relatively successfully tried to narrow it down. But so sometimes people think, oh, that's the real cause. That's the one cause. No, it could be, but that's also what psychologists do.
Right.
To be clear, what psychologists are trying to do is get to the most basic, universal, most of them, human factor. And they're willing to trade off that to say, well, this is the most important thing. But that's not for the practitioner, the individual. That's not always the most useful lens, actually. Knowing what the norm is doesn't explain you. It is helpful, but that you are an individual. You can be anywhere on the distribution of any of these factors. But that's not a popular position among research psychologists because they're trying to do something different. But let me say that. The second thing I would say about these 6 dimensions is they map onto from other perspectives, research on fundamental needs and drives, and motivations that arise from those needs and drives. One thing that's not there, maybe value conflict gets close to this. It's kind of meaning, purpose, fulfillment.
Right. Yep.
And it's been a while. I must admit, it's been a while since I read that book and maybe subsequent research, but. So I think it's that, to me, gives it a kind of credibility. They're observing this empirically in environments, I don't believe with the intention of affirming or confirming these drives and needs, but there's a way you can look at the tangible expressions directly connected back to these needs. To me, that's really important.
Yeah. No, that's where I say it's initially a good way to just start probing. Like, I think there's a lot of excavation that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing is kind of getting the lay of the land and understanding, what, because it'd be easy to just think it's this one thing and then address it that way and not realize that, again, there might be other, the hole that you need to go down is somewhere else, not necessarily this one that seems obvious, or that other people are experiencing and you've heard about, and you say, okay, well, that must be me because I'm burned out. They're burned out. They think it's lack of community when in fact that's not really what's play for you. And that's to your point. Like it's there's you have to be your own detective, or you have to engage in some introspection. And this is kind of the first step is to assess what really is draining you. And I like that word, they used erosion of the soul. I thought that was a great way. Like there's this erosion going on. And so, and these are ways in which it manifests itself. And now it's like, okay, what are really the root causes that need to be explored?
Well, back to your point, I think that excavation is crucial because I think most approaches to burnout are about energy.
Right.
I'm tired. I should rest. I'm not opposed to rest. That's not the point, but it's not like, why am I tired? Why do I feel exhaustion? And is that the only thing I'm experiencing? So I think that that kind of interrogation or that excavation is really crucial.
So what? So let's say you start, you do start that process of, of introspection and self-reflection. You're looking deeper. How do you like, they have solutions for each of the 6 ways or manners of erosions of the soul, be it work overload, lack of control, lack of reward, lack of community, lack of fairness, value conflict. And they have solutions for each one of those. Did you find those helpful, or do you find those are kind of, again, they're more like, they don't have the multi-dimensional or depth that they really should have?
Well, I think, this book that I'm drawing, I just want to be clear. This is like an initial it's like one of the first studies. Well, I think, and then there's a theoretical angle. So in my work, I'm usually working with individuals who are not in a position to change the institution, its culture, its practices. So, I'm saying, what can you do within the context? Whereas I think their audience is more to people who are making some decisions about how their organizations and institutions and corporations and bureaucracies run. So there's a little bit of a difference in what the agent can do, what are the opportunities. So I will say that, so I think more contemporary burnout research really puts a lot of onus on the institution and says, the institution shouldn't do this, the organization shouldn't do that, the school, the corporation shouldn't do that. That's not conducive to your well-being, and it leads to burnout, to burnout. And in any given case, that could be true. But my work as a kind of coaching is, okay, here's the situation. It's really not, those levers are not available to you, not in any short run. What are you going to do within that context? Which doesn't mean to leave it alone. I always mean to give the caveat. If you cannot be burnout and you have more energy, then you have energy to change the institution. Right. These are not mutually exclusive. Let me say that. So I think some people buy that. Others are like, no, I'm acting on principle. You're telling me to fix the problem the institution causes, and that doesn't feel right. Maybe that's lack of fairness and leads me to feel unmotivated. And I'm not unsympathetic, but so I think that's one thing. Some people don't like my angle because it's focused on the individual. That's a parameter that I choose in that work. But I think one of the challenges, to get back to one of the points I made, is it's hard to see the path forward out of burnout when you're burnout, because you're burnout.
Right.
Like, oh, that's a lot of work.
Yep.
That's not gonna be effective. Cynicism. I'm not operating at my best when I'm burnout. I'm ineffective. I don't have much confidence. So those are some, what I might call, barriers to change. There's the task of changing, doing things different, but then there's how we think about change. I might call that a barrier, an obstacle itself, right? Like, so that can be challenging.
Is that okay to pause there and ask a question? I think that's a really good, I think that's so key. Like, when you're burned out, it's, you realize that it's going to require energy and effort to change, to stop. And so it makes you're less inclined to want to make those changes, because you're, like you said. So the question is, well, then what in you can give you the motivation to say, nevertheless,
yes,
I'm going to make these, how do you counsel students in that?
Well, that's a great point. So I think, from a motivational point of view, I like to think about motivations, their properties, and their effects, not in a moral framework, but in what are the properties of different kinds of motivations and what are their effects. So intrinsic motivation has a particular kind of properties. It actually tends to energize us, right? So we want to keep playing platform tennis. We want to stay, right? You're having fun out there playing whatever, and you want to keep doing it. Like, you don't feel tired. Or you're writing, you're lost in your coding, or you're writing, or you're reading, and you don't want to stop. That's a sign that you have energy. So why? I think a lot of that's due to intrinsic motivation. Well, why do you have that? There's some idiosyncrasy of personal interest or connection. So one fundamental move then, to anytime when I'm working with students, is to very subtly switch a question, like, do I like this? Am I interested in this class? That's not the question. The question is, what about the class am I interested in? It's not because the first question leads to a yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. I'm not interested in this class. None of it? Why'd you sign up? Has no relevance or value?
Right.
You have not read or said anything that's interesting to you. So the point is, the one point is that you're looking for what's intrinsically motivating, and which one kind of which is interest. We can go through others, but so intrinsic motivation tend to have fewer downsides. Right. So a kind of I'm motivated to achieve. Well, you can fail. It's hard to, and that's always readily apparent. That failure can be out of your control. If you're a Princeton, a computer and a coding class with a bunch of other people who have training and you do not, and there's some kind of implicit curve or comparison grading, like there's a good chance you're not going to achieve your grade goal. So if you attach your motive, that's a source of your motivation by what you attend to and intend, that's already precarious. Plus it just invokes anxiety because as we talked about last time, if you are seeking some kind of attainment that's in other people's hands, you risk that. Versus, let's explore. Let me look for things that I'm interested in. There's not a way there's much less precarity to that. You might not find anything, but it's not a risk, right? But more often people do find things because they're in this and that world. There is a reason they're in that situation and context and not others. So that's one kind. So intrinsic motivation has these properties. If we can lift up looking for, searching out, and savoring intrinsic motivation, then that energizes us. Well, that's the antidote to burnout. So we get some fulfillment, gratification. It's interesting, we get a little momentum, and that can spread to other dimensions, right? But so that's one move. Another is, there's another kind of motivational framework. So again, I'm coming at that angle. So I'd be curious to punch it back to you and say, from your point of view, what do you think?
Yep.
So what are some other powerful motivations? I mean, even the act of autonomy, saying I'm going to do something and not that. I'm going to exert some control. What's a way I can exert control, put my stamp on this, maybe in the smallest possible way. Hopefully that's pro-social or productive, right? Sometimes people exert their autonomy and control in resistance and that creates a problem. But can you do that without creating some backlash to you? But then you have a sense of control, right? If you feel hopeless or helpless, hapless, you don't have control, that feeling is demotivating. Can you get that sense? And it probably goes back to your sense of self. So I think there's that. And okay, refashioning. Okay, there's not much you like about this class. Could you go to the professor and say, hey, professor, could I slightly change the assignment to tap into some motivations that I have? And I'm not going to do less work. I'm going to do more. Let me explain that to you. Is that a move that you could make? So that's easier than doing an assignment you don't care about and forcing white knuckling yourself through 20 hours of some research and writing you want to do. So so that's a possibility as a concrete example. I think there's other practical ones. So then in terms of motivation, another one would be, trying to tap into relevance, significance. Why? So these are often extrinsic. They're extrinsic motivators, not intrinsic, but they're deeply internalized. They're connected to your values, your beliefs, your principles. So, definitely sitting across the table from a pre-med student who doesn't like physics or organic chemistry, and helping them really tap into, not only that it helps them, partly gets to med school, but to be a better doctor. Both. They're not mutually exclusive, right? You want to go to med school. And so that's its relevance and utility for you. Are you thinking about that on Thursday morning when you have an hour before class, but you could be reviewing the physics textbook? If you're not, then you're not using your motivation and then to drive your intention to get the most out of the class. It's not a moral judgment. It's just saying here's this motivational resource available to you. But that takes some effort, some reminding. Okay, that's connected to my values. I want to be of service. I want to make social impact. I'm fascinated by the human body. Those are all kinds of things. I guess that's more intrinsic motivation. And I want to lift up my family, my community. So I want to do healthcare, be a physician for that purpose. Those are not intrinsic. but that can be very, very powerful, therefore very, very energizing. But like most motivations, if you're not thinking about it, particularly those extrinsic, you have to be thinking about it, putting your attention on it for it to have much effect. Now, what I think happens too is, so if you're thinking about what's interesting, and you're lifting that up, and you're thinking about what's useful and relevant, and the reason why you're doing this for your family or community are kind of altruistic, then what are you not thinking about? The grade, the fear, the comparison. Right. This often sap our energies. So a root also here is a replacement principle of psychology. It's not about denying or removing a thought, right? Don't think about the pink elephant. It's about replacing, putting something in our mind, our consciousness, our intention, our attention, that in this binary way kind of blocks out the other thing without seeking to block it out. And if you pick the right thing, or you pick things that are tapping into your motivation, like that's what I mean by right, then you can have these both the benefits. You're removing or reducing anxiety that comes from imagining a score, a grade, its consequences for med school, and what that means for your student loans, and whether you're going to have prestige. And students do think about these things during the exam, and instead, and sometimes counterintuitively, put other thoughts that evoke other motivations and different kinds of energy into your mind. So those are, I think, broadly speaking, maybe the strategies I work with students. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I those are great. I feel like there's a move prior to those that needs to be addressed or highlighted. And that's, there's something that has to fundamentally change or in yourself. And to kind of get into that, I know I've said this before, but I used to give this talk to students at the beginning of the year. I'd say, remember there's only one person you're with your whole life, and who is that? People come in and out of your life, family, friends, colleagues. They come and go, and that's just a fact of life. But there's one person you're always with, and they get it. They're themselves. And then the question is, well, do you how much do you care and like yourself? And a lot of students don't really like themselves, which is tragic. But I think there's this realization that you have to come to really care enough about yourself to say, no, I need to make changes. I know it's gonna be tough, but I don't want to live my life this way. And again, we're getting back to that whole point of, in the current, because it's easy, because so many people are just kind of managing their burnout. They're kind of burned out, but they're not like so depleted that they've hit this point where they realize they've got to make change. They haven't hit rock bottom, so they're kind of managing their burnout. But it's kind of like, well, that's what they think that everyone else is doing that. So, well, I just got to keep kind of just keep at it. And
inevitable.
Yeah, it's inevitable. I just got to deal with it. And then the others say, this is nuts. I don't want to live my life like this. I don't. And when they do that, I think that you're fundamentally, in whatever small way, disassociating yourself with the world a bit, be it the context and the culture and the flow or the current of what most people are saying. You're saying, no, I'm, in a way, it's like taking control. Like you're saying, no, I'm not going to be prey to these forces that and these influences that are out there, and what my culture is telling me, my context is telling me. I think that's a fundamental move that precedes and gives you that initial energy to engage in some of these strategies. So I think that's really important. And all the so just kind of at an existential level, I think burnout is a product of these factors, but all these point to a relationship to the world that's inherently unhealthy, because you are investing yourself and in a way, or relying on the world in a way that it's always it can't provide what you need.
Mhm.
And so you have these expectations, the way things should be, they're not. And so it's exhausting, it's draining you, because you wanting it to give you this energy, this feedback that
Right.
will energize you, and it doesn't. And then that's the erosion of the soul. So the question is, well, what does the soul really need? And yeah, it needs to have some interaction. I mean, you're always going to be interacting with the world. So, but what is that relationship, and what's the perspective you need to really thrive for yourself, regardless of how the world sees that? But that fundamental disassociation is really key, I think. It's interesting. I don't, this is where I'll bore people who are listening to this. I've been reading Plotinus. I don't know if you've heard of who he is, Plotinus, at all. He's
Spell that.
Plotinus, Plotinus. He was, I want to say, 3rd century AD, or yeah, CE.
I think I follow him on Instagram, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, right. So he was a Platonist, but he was what they called Neoplatonism. And he was very influential to Christian thinkers. So you have Plato, Socrates in gosh, I can't remember which, where he's kind of he's about to drink the hemlock. I can't remember the dialogue.
There, sorry.
That kills me. I can't remember. It's right on the tip of my tongue. I'll remember as soon as we end this discussion or the talk. I'll remember it. Anyway, there's this idea that we were once like our souls were contemplating the eternal forms, and then we've fallen out of that state into our physical bodies, and we've undergone amnesia. And so anytime you get like an aha or real great insight, that's you recollecting the eternal form. So you never really learn anything, you just recollect, you remember you rediscover what you knew previously. That's an aha moment. So Neoplatonism is in that, it's explaining that in a way by how we've kind of like this eternal, like the soul, we've fallen into our body. So there's this clear distinction between the world and our souls, our true selves. And so you have to kind of disassociate, but really in a dramatic way. At least a lot of Christians, contemplatives, took that. Like you had to, you had the desert fathers who would go off and not try to not have any relationship with society at all, and they did these extreme ascetic lives, to the point where a lot of them would die early because they were practically killing themselves. So I'm not advocating that, and I think that they were wrong. And I was reading Plotinus because just to rereading, I read it a long time ago, but rereading it because just to try to understand better the influence he had on Augustine.
Right.
And there's a really influential book by someone named Pseudo Dionysius. Don't probably sounding pedantic at this point, but anyway, these really influenced later Christian thinkers. But there was this asceticism, the idea that the world was evil, and so you had to disassociate it with it. And I think that's wrong. The question, because from a Christian perspective, God created the world and it was good. So it's our misappropriation and misuse and distortions of the world and our perspective on the world that makes it, quote unquote, not good for us. And the world was always, it was always a place of transience and change. And that's what the idea of evil comes from. Like you see this in a lot of Christian and non-Christian philosophy of that, antiquity into the Middle Ages, that, what's pure and good is that which is eternal, and anything that's prey to change is not good or evil. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm making sense here, but the point is that what the good that can come out of that thinking is that we want something we want a sense of meaning and purpose, but we want it to be constant, always present, consistent, eternal, all these words. It's always there. And so when we have an over reliance on on those things in this world that can't do that, I think that's a formula for burnout. And that's what we're seeing here. Like when, expectations on what our workload should be, what our work should be, what the institutions or our company and organization should do, what this other person or colleague should do. We're projecting these expectations, and the question is, can we reevaluate those in a way that makes it so we're less reliant? That doesn't mean we withdraw emotionally or we're not invested in people and not invested in our jobs or organizations. It just means we change our perspective on where we're going to get our meaning and purpose fulfillment in the midst of those contexts, which I know sounds abstract, but this is why we talk. Obviously I have my way of doing it, which is, and you have your way of doing it through, secular, or I know you call it secular Buddhist, but like Buddhist practices, and I have my contemplative Christianity and focus on relationship with God. But then there's all these other ways that can make things better, like, finding intrinsic motivations and whatnot, the kind of strategies that you were talking about. So anyway, I'll stop talking and let you respond.
I really wanted to hear that angle, and hopefully a few other people out listening did too. So I'm trained as a psychologist. I dabble in Buddhist philosophy, and that has a lot of convergences. So yeah, I think one thing, just since we're now at that strata, which we often get to, the strata of the philosophical, the existential, as an aside, to add pedanticness to more. So actually, there is a strong encounter of Bactrian Greek philosophy and Buddhism. So Bactrian meaning in what would be present day Afghanistan. These are outposts of the Greek, and there are cities and outposts that show a strong interconnection between Greek philosophy and thinking and Buddhism about 5 centuries before BCE, which is an interesting thread of that these have some deep roots historically and philosophically. But so I think one thread that I pick up too from what you're saying is that often the insight, the realization, I need to do something different, I need to act differently, some awareness of this situation or the way I've constructed the world I'm in, I need to go against that grain. That creates a kind of dissatisfaction, disgruntlement. That one thing I'm tasked to remember is, and that has an impulse in it because a desire to have equanimity, to be fulfilled, right? So there's a desire to be fulfilled, to have meaning and purpose. That is basic. And when we don't have it, we feel this dissatisfaction. But we can also say, and then we often put our attention on that. We can say, wow, what does it mean for human beings to have this desire for meaning and purpose? Isn't that amazing? You have it. You're experiencing it. Now, the consequence of experiencing that desire for meaning, purpose, and fulfillment right now in this circumstance is dissatisfaction, suffering, pain, in various kinds. But we shouldn't forget that the origin of that is the disconnect, right? The misalignment. And I like that thought a lot, but I don't always remember it. So I think that's, we're plumbing the human condition. What is the right? What is a human being? What are our needs? And the insights from 2,500 years of thought are different than what prevail today.
Right.
And so that knowledge and insight is available to us. Now, it doesn't make it automatically true. I will simply say that these insights about human beings converge. To me, I'm persuaded that many wisdom traditions converge on the same insights, and that those insights about what it means to be a human being and to have human community and human action are quite different than the prevailing beliefs and specifically structures and actions of society today. Then sometimes we hear the profession, the words sound similar to what was said before, but I don't know that the structures are there. The point being, from my vantage point, from a Buddhist perspective, is the kind of first move is have an accurate, undistorted view of the nature of where you're at.
Yeah.
Meaning, so in one case is, does our fulfillment come from our attainment, our achievements, doing more, getting recognition from people, and that those are things people are pursuing, that when they're not realized, right? If you think back to those principles, that's what creates the problem.
Yep.
You don't have to pursue them. You don't have to value them. I think the value conflict is of a different order of cause, which is, I do think that is based on deep insight about human beings. Human beings want to act in accordance with their values, and when they're acting in ways that are not, or feel compelled to act in ways they're not, they, I'd say, rightfully feel tumult. They feel stress. That is a sign, right, of a little bit different kind of our impulse to act on our values, to act ethically by our own light.
Yeah, so I think that point there, which is good, is the fact that
so maybe we're coming back to I would say we're coming back to one thing about the so what. We're coming back to a good theory is always is quite practical. But what were you going to say?
Oh, well, I'd just say, the fact that, we are creatures that seek meaning, purpose, and fulfillment. So we have the capacity to burn out.
Right.
So that's something to acknowledge. Another, I just wanted to, as you're talking, it kind of popped in my head. And it was something I was thinking about when I was reading this. There's a great quote by Viktor Frankl, whose book was it, Man's Search for Meaning, I think is the book, his famous book. And if you don't know who Viktor Frankl was, he was in a concentration camp during World War II, and observing individuals who had a purpose or meaning for their lives. They're the ones who tend to survive, or those who gave up hope. There's the ones who didn't. Anyway, he had this great quote that I've used in a lot of Bible studies, and I'm going to just paraphrase. He said, between stimulus from the outside world and our response, there's a gap, and that gap, that moment determines who we are, basically. Like, are we someone who is so tied to that stimulus that we even forget ourselves? And this is where I think a lot of folks are. They're just so preoccupied with their lived world, what's going on, that they just forget that there is this soul that's seeking meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, and that this soul is invested in the lived world and always will be in the lived world, but is distinct. And you have to just make have that pause to understand that. Like, that's what Frankl's talking about. Like, you don't have to be how you react. You don't have to be determined, or you don't have to be prey to how the stimulus is coming to you. And so realizing that, and then realizing that you have a particular way you've learned and adapted in a way to have a perspective on those. So that determines how you respond, and you need to examine that perspective, because that might need to change. And the way I see that, and which grieves me, is that I feel like today, especially, and you've mentioned this before, pointed to it, that students, I think not just students, I think a lot of individuals we are conditioned to think that somehow the problems are outside of us, and solely outside of us. So I'm not feeling content, fulfilled, I'm feeling burned out, so the institution needs to change, or my organization needs to make these changes. And in a way that, like you said, they might be right. Like, nothing's perfect, but they tend to move at glacier speed. They're not glacial. They're not necessarily going to change and adapt as quickly as you want. So the question is, what can you do about it? So to your point, it's not like we're saying you're wrong. It's just saying you're setting yourself up for more frustration, because these institutions aren't going to cater to your needs as much as you think they should. So anyway, I thought that was a really interesting point. And so again, the question is, can you love yourself enough and you see that you've kind of, like, if you come to a point where you say, I don't want to live like this anymore, so that I think gives the initial energy to start engaging in the strategies that will help you create a more fulfilling, enjoyable life.
So let me ask you, I mean, that's always very compelling and powerful when I hear you say that. One thing that occurred to my, I don't think this is the first time I ever thought of this. So how do we help someone who's, instead of saying, this is my circumstances or the situation is really bad, I don't want to live like this anymore, rather than saying, I'm really bad.
Instead of saying
I'm really bad can be very demotivating.
Totally.
I'm suffering, I can't live like this anymore is different, but that's rather than the conclusion, the insight might be, I'm terrible.
Yeah, I've always been asked, this is where I ask questions, and when I've counseled students and others.
Okay, yeah. But what can a person do? Go ahead. But yeah.
Well, I think I would say, and I don't know if I'm not going to be a very therapeutic. This is my,
yeah.
I'm just kind of, I think that, well, I'm bad. Sometimes I feel like that's a cop out, because that's you just saying,
right.
I don't want to make the change.
Right.
And I think if you make that cop out, then you don't, and this sounds bad, but that's an unhealthy, that's not really loving yourself. That's just beating yourself because you don't want to make the changes. And then I'm like, then if someone does that, I could be like, oh no, that's wrong. But am I really helping them? I say, I would be more inclined to say, you know what? I think that deep down you can make the change. I mean, I'd be more like, you might say that, but I don't think that's really true. And I think, I don't know if I would say that's a cop out to their face, but I would be like, okay, I think that is kind of a way of just not really wanting to make the changes, so because I think deep down, if you really love yourself, you go like, no, I'm willing to make some changes. And some people don't get there, and so you have to, they have to make their own choices. And sometimes it's really hard to let people, when you know that they have the capacity to make change, but they don't want to, they're just not ready to. So you go, okay. And I can tell them, hey, I think you can, you can do it. I believe in you. And hopefully just keep talking to them until the point where they come to say, yeah, I really do want to make those changes. I don't know. That's my initial gut reaction.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I find really compelling about that is what you're saying is loving yourself is more important than the shame you feel.
Yeah.
And then that, right. And I mean, that's a hard, who's going to argue against that? That seems actually quite productive. It even fits into our society in a way, but in a slightly different way. Like, then the question is, how do you get to a point where you genuinely love yourself? So I kind of heard some hedging. You're saying, well, I don't know if this would be received. Those would be harsh. I mean, I don't think saying the crux of the matter is you coming to love yourself sounds very harsh. I don't think it's harsh to say, I want you to love yourself more than you feel ashamed. Like, I don't think that is harsh myself. Maybe if you're in that state of deep shame, you would. But I don't see it that way. I guess another move might be that would be a little more challenging, but could be less directive, would be to say, why are you beating yourself up? Not why, meaning what are the events, but what does it do? What is the act?
Right.
How does that function? And does it have some unintended consequences that you're not aware of?
Or I because you do this in your procrastination course and talks, you're saying, well, procrastination serves some needs. It's satisfying in some way. So what is that? I've always appreciated that. So you're right. Like, the shame does, we cater to it. Like, you don't have to feel ashamed. Shame is a response. Right. It's an interpretation of your experience, and it's auto-generated. It's not like shame exists out there and you somehow caught this virus.
Right.
It's an interpretation. So that's not to diminish it or to say, yeah, it can be very destructive. So it's to say, if you feel shame, it's not like you're powerless. That's untrue. And the fact that we treat it like that way is, to me, is a real shame.
Well, it brings back the point, right? So what I would say from a psychological point of view, we're trying to understand the mechanism. How does one come to feel shame? What is the process? What does it look like? And then you're pointing, and it feels like this thing happened that someone can shame me. I've always felt that uninteresting. They shamed me. Like, well, they can try to shame you.
Right.
But I think shame is about relationship to oneself.
Yep.
Now it can feel, and I'm not saying there aren't powerful forces. And if everybody on your social media feed is saying certain things that you would feel the same, that's completely understandable. But to go back to your point, to Frankel, there's still a moment between stimulus and response. So what happens in that response? Well, what happens to many people and most people in lots of circumstances is these quite predictable responses where they feel ashamed. We can acknowledge the fact of that without saying it's inevitable. We can also make the observation that it's not inevitable without judging people that it is common. Like we don't have to judge that. We can simply say there's a possibility. Well, why is that important? Well, that gives us some hope, some sense of control. We could also then say, how would I have a different response? What would that look like? How have people done it in the past?
And point of fact, they have.
That's right.
So the fact that two people respond so differently, one feels shame and one doesn't, tells you that, shame isn't inevitable. You don't have to cater to that, even though it's common. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut your.
Well, I think that's a great point, and it's super powerful. I mean, So I think shame and guilt, and there's some important differences, and that's in the back of my mind here. I'm not ready to go there in terms of this conversation, but there's some important differences from a self-worth theory point of view between shame and guilt. But in generally, to come back to your point, you made this observation. I make a similar point with respect to procrastination, and if it's common, people keep doing it. You keep doing it. It suggests that it serves a function, it meets a need or drive of some kind, maybe in a maladaptive way or counterintuitive. If you're not aware, you don't see how that. But that's a good question. It's a starting point in a non-judgmental way. What does this repeated behavior do? So you could look at burnout itself in that point of view, or you could say, why do I keep doing things that burn me out?
Right.
Why do I make choices? Why do I put myself in situations? What need or drive? So I think overextended, if that's kind of my definition. Overextended and undercommitted is I'm not acting on my values of commitment to things that I care deeply about. I'm extending myself out there into the world, the live world, to get something that I have a need for. Humans have needs for social connection, but or I've associated in my mind that if I do a lot of things and seem important and achieve a lot, that will lead to this fulfilling the need that I have of meaning and purpose and recognition and value in other people's eyes, in my own eyes. And I think that's mistaken, but it's understandable that someone would do that. So overcommitment to me is very much the same, can be understood as very much the same dynamic as procrastination.
Yeah, no, it's a great, like what, I'm just trying to extend it to shame. Even though we're talking about burnout, but I need to think more about, I've given some attention to like what need does shame fulfill, but I haven't really explored it as much as I should have. And I've done it more from a Christian point of view.
Yeah.
Because in the, if you know the story of the fall, the Garden of Eden, as soon as Adam and Eve fall, they're naked beforehand, they clothe themselves. And when God shows up, like, where are you? They're hiding in the forest because they feel shame. So I've done it's an interesting dynamic there. It's like the poetry is really powerful because but I don't want. That's probably a topic for another time.
Well, let's go for another time. But let me throw out one thought. I'm essentially, I was raised Catholic, and so I know that something about that story. But it's interesting, and that has struck me too. So there's the shame of being viewed by others. So this shame, I'm unclothed. I guess that's I'm guessing metaphorical for something like I'm impure, something like that. I don't know. But they could feel guilty for eating apple because they're not supposed to, right? So that would typically be guilt. I did something that I shouldn't have. In the self-worth theory, it's I am not something I should be. That's That's right. I'm not capable. I should be able to do this, but I can't. That being that recognition, or I am something that's not good, and that's people recognizing that is creates shame in me. So guilt, in the software theory, is you didn't do something you could have.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, this is again, the story only goes so far. Like, and when I've taught it, we usually, again, this is a little off topic, but we tend to think, oh, they're bad, they ate the apple. I'm like, well, I'm always like, well, is eating the apple really the sin, or is it the fact that? And I have always made the point that it's they take over control of how to determine what the good life is for themselves. And it says that Eve, she saw that it was good to eat. So all these ways of deliberating or evaluating her choices become different from what it was before. So she's already fallen, and that's a manifestation. And by doing that, this is the way I make it relevant. I said she has, and Adam and Eve have determined that their lives, what their meaning, purpose in their lives should be determined by the things of this world, like eating this, gaining wisdom. Like, so they're in the center of their lives.
Bonding to this other entity.
Yeah, and so, and with that, and this is where I kind of bring in some loader. The outside world, they need it, but it also becomes a threat, and so that's why it has to be managed.
Mm-hmm.
And the outside world, like Eve to Adam and Adam to Eve, they become something they need, but also kind of a threat. And so that the fact that they're naked, I need to manage that situation. So I clothe myself so the other person doesn't see me as I really am. So you have to manage. You see that? Like, you have to manage who you are perceived to be in what you think they perceive you to be. So in a way, it makes it so relevant to us, because that's exactly what we're doing. Like, most of us are clothing ourselves in how we, like, in a way of, oh, I'm a good student, or I'm a great colleague, or I'm this, or I'm that. I'm managing people's expectations because I'm ashamed of what I am internally, or if people really saw me for what I am. And so that need, manifests a sense of not really loving yourself, or not really appreciating yourself, or accepting yourself. And so, can you get to a point where you don't need other people to see you or perceive you in a certain way? That's really hard, and
one thing that strikes me is it converges on contemporary psychology, right? So if you're familiar with Irving Goffman, that we're spending a lot of time, managing the perceptions of others, and what is the mechanism of that? So your analysis of the story captures this psychological reality that so many people experience.
Yeah.
Right. It's not only that, but it's certainly grounded in that.
Yeah. All right. So we should probably wrap up, and I think eventually we should do a deeper exploration of shame. I think because there's a couple. I have books on it that I've read, but it's been a while. I'd love to talk about it more. But anyway, so just like as a so what, or how do we wrap this up?
Well, I think so maybe my message is, so burnout's a real thing. It's not just some colloquial thing, it's just burnout, or no, that it can be a sign of some important disjunctures, and can lead one to reflect on the one hand, and that can lead to deep, important insights, and to look beyond mere workload and energy to say, what's going on for myself, and is my value alignment, some of these other human needs that most of us have for reward, community. It's not that we want to give those up, but are those maybe disproportionately or unhelpfully affecting your experience? And might you be able to manage or change those even in a positive way? If you're not, maybe you don't realize, I'm not feeling much positive sense of community. And the solution to that isn't to work more, I don't think, get all the work done that your burnout is making you feel. It's actually to create some foundations, relationships, to collaborate, do some of those things. But that's not at all intuitive, the response to burnout. Most people actually isolate and double down or at least try to. So I think, again, like a lot of things, the deeper underlying solution may not be is counterintuitive, and actually can be positive in the sense you're acting on these needs to meet them, not simply doing more of the thing that actually doesn't work to meet your needs. I think another is to recognize that it is hard when you're feeling burnout to muster the energy to do it. So we can recognize that. And then maybe a third point is, while we can want and even work toward changing features of our communities and organizations, institutions, we don't have to wait. And in fact, overcoming burnout could help you make those changes.
Right.
So it's grabbing on to, hanging on to, embracing that autonomy, that control, that efficaciousness. I can do something in my situation.
Right. Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Nick. I was just looking at the list, the 6 things. It's interesting how it's lack of, like 4 of the 6 have lack of community, lack of fairness, and so on and so forth. So I'm always wondering, like, instead of like trying, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but they're saying like, okay, you have lack of community. Well, how do I work to create a better sense of community? Well, that could feed still the over reliance on community, and lack of reward. Well, how do some of us, it'd be easy to think, well, how do I make it more likely that I get the rewards that I need, versus saying, what kind of reward do I need in the first place, or why do I need this sense of reward, and how much do I need it, and do I have to have it? I think that's a deeper, harder question, but and again, it's not like for community, I say this, like, it's not like you just go off and live a hermit's life, but it's also, how can you see community as a gift when you have it? Because it is a fleeting sense of community. And if I try to overmanage it and try to sustain this sense of community, I think that's a recipe for continued burnout. Versus, can I get to a point where I see it as a gift when I enjoy it, but knowing that it is fleeting. Mm-hmm. It's going to be there sometimes, and sometimes it's not. And I'm not going to get frustrated when it's not. But when I have it, I'm like, oh, this is great. I really enjoy it, appreciate it. And when it starts to ebb, I'm like, okay, there might be another season when you can hold these things a little more loosely. Mm-hmm. I think that's when you get to that point, then you're in a much better position. And so now, to get there, you have to be finding your fulfillment somewhere else. And the question is, where is that somewhere else? And again, this is where we get into our particular religious traditions, but also I think just, as you've mentioned, there are ways to become intrinsically motivated, and those things are always accessible. And that's what's great about them. Community, or some of these other things, rewards, they are external to a certain extent, and so that they are intermittent, fleeting, changing, contingent. And so intrinsic motivations are always available. And so it's finding those intrinsic motivations and loving yourself enough to know that that's where you got to go. And you got to get to the point where you say, I love myself so much that I'm willing to make some hard choices. So that's my last thoughts.
Well, I love it. That's exactly what why I want to talk about this, because you took these points and then brought this other lens, and I think a deeper one that organizational psychologists are not going to address, right? Right. And that's fine. These are useful. Yeah, these are useful starting points, but then so these are useful, but maybe not complete, and they adopt a particular perspective that you bring another one, and then does that and shed some light and illuminate, see some commonalities? Can we connect it to other phenomenon? Does it point to some other moves that we need to do? Like you said, I think there's a prior question, there's a prior move we need to do around self-acceptance and love that's not discussed. So that's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation. Yeah. I do want to give one slight caveat. It's been a while since I read the original text. So the document you're referring to that says lack of, I did write that. Right. I don't recall if they use that language. Just so if anybody goes back and looks at Maslach and Leiter and says, actually, they don't say that. We have a document that I wrote some years ago that uses that terminology. I just want to make sure that I don't misrepresent maybe not a colleague, Maslach, but a colleague of my dear mentor. I would not want to misrepresent their work.
Right.
That was my interpretation.
I appreciate that, because I am looking at the I think the PDF when you scan the section, and they the only one they have is lack of control. The other one says we feel overloaded, we are not rewarded for our work, we are experiencing a breakdown in community. And so there's saying lack of is okay, it's similar, it's synonymous enough to warrant how you wrote it, but a good point, well taken. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Matt. Like I said, I really wanted to hear your vantage point, as always, very illuminating and brought a richness and depth that existential philosopher and a thoughtful human being can add to this research.
Well, and I just want to make sure that it goes right back at you, because, and I know my mentor Jim Leiter would be so happy, because his last book was called Logic of the Spirit, and was trying to show the relationship between theology, or I would really call it existentialism, and psychology. And he was trying to say that these two can be really, when they are aligned correctly and respect their field, but where they cross over, then they're truly illuminating. It's when they're disassociated, like when existentialism is just out there floating, it's not very practical, where clinical psychology can be kind of just kind of focus on one strata and not really get to the depth of human dynamics. So I think that the engagement of the two is really exciting. So I'm glad we're doing these talks. So
that might be a topic unto itself. But thanks again, Matt.
All right.
Wrap up there.
Good. All right. Take care.
See ya.